Hello. Thank you so much for joining me on my podcast today. I have these amazing women from the Florida Chapter National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, Seri, May, and Prianca. I am so grateful to be talking to you today.
Well,
Hi.
really,
All
thank you for
right.
having us.
Yes, yes, I'm super psyched. So I would love if each of you would just take, a little bit of time to share a little bit about your background and how you got involved with, can I say NAPAWF so that we're not doing
NAPAWF is
NAPAWF? Okay.
yes, NAPAWF.
Awesome. Okay. So how you got involved with NAPAWF and what it means to you to be a part of it, and whoever wants to jump in first. Or Priyanka?
So yeah, I can jump in first. So I'm Priyanka. I've been a member since I think June of last year as part of the Florida chapter. I actually got involved because my sister like used to work for NAPAWF, so she kind of introduced me, and it was really funny because I feel like I was like a pseudo member, like off to the side, because when she
Yeah.
would do like meetings and stuff, I would kind of be like lurking behind and like just kind of like listening in. And all of the meetings just sounded so interesting to me, and I wanted to become more involved in like being an activist and just learning more about like my history as an AAPI woman especially in Florida. So after a couple months of like eavesdropping, I finally like was like, okay, I'm ready to be a member now.
I love
um,
it.
yeah, so I've been a member since June, and I'm like, I think I'm an active member working my way up to becoming a leader for the Florida chapter.
Excellent. Awesome. And May?
Yeah, thank you. My name is May Thach, she, hers. I am also like my family immigrated to Florida when I was about 8 years old. And I basically grew up in St. Petersburg. So I do call myself a Floridian. And sometimes that's not, that's a very conscious choice because I know that not a lot of folks will give us good impressions when we say that. But yeah, and I was involved after graduating from University of South Florida in Tampa. I was not ready to like, get my master's. I was like burnt out of school. And then so I decided to kind of, pursue my like a dream that I had since I was in high school, which was join the Peace Corps. So I did that for
Wow.
about 4 years in Peace Corps, and I was in Zambia, which is in sub-Saharan Africa. That's where I originally went there as an education volunteer, so teaching English, but then I transferred to another position that was kind of a like a coordinator position for volunteers. And then my service was over, but I did not want to come back to the US really at that time. So I continued my work in Zambia in a different position, which is kind of how I'm like got involved in NAPAWF is because over there I did work in like reproductive health and reproductive education, sexuality education in Zambia, and so I worked a lot closely with our adolescent girls and young women there. So then when I came back to the US, I honestly didn't know there was like I wasn't like really clear on what degree I wanted to pursue, but I wanted to continue in development work. And so then I found a program in San Diego, which was regarding international development and nonprofit management, but with a Southeast Asian regional track. So for me too, like I similarly to a few other folks as API in Florida, I didn't really feel like I was super like API. Like I wasn't really part of the community outside of my immediate community. And so I didn't really look into like what it was like to be an API person. But through my program in San Diego and being more like entrenched in a community where like you saw API like everywhere, right? In California. And so from there, from what I've learned, I wanted to come back and really continue that kind of grassroots level work and then really focusing in on Asian American issues. And honestly, a friend of mine like sent me this position. She was like, hey, I know you're like looking for positions. And I was like researching like program coordinator, program manager, because like those were positions I had. And I had assumed that organizers were volunteer based. Like I never think like there are actually positions you can apply for. And so then my friend sent it to me, and I was like, wait, this is going to sound cheesy, but this feels like a position perfectly written for me, And so when I had originally applied for NAPAWF, it was like, yeah, I was like, I really want to get this position because it was like perfect for what I was looking for after I graduated. And yeah, and I've been with NAPAWF since August of this year, which feels far away, but also not that far away either. And I've been really excited to work with very like committed and dedicated folks at the Florida chapter.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing, May. And Seri, of course.
Yeah, so I'm Seri. Hey, everyone. I serve as the National Campaign and Membership Director at NAPAWF. I've been working here for the past 3 years, and although I'm not technically based in Florida, I'm actually based in Chicago, Illinois. Part of my role is leading the strategy and the implementation of our field work in Florida. And so really helping lead the expansion of NAPAWF into key states like Florida and Texas, particularly when it comes to defending voting rights and then also reproductive rights and health and justice.
Yes.
For sure. And so kind of like my story coming to NAPAWF. So I've been organizing for the past 5 years. I actually started out in high school. And really it came into movement work through immigrant rights work. And that was really the focus. A lot of that was due to my personal history as a child of immigrants, and then just like, not being able to access so many like things that a lot of people take for granted here, like being able to access healthcare, being able to access like food stamps, like things like those basic like services. And so because of that kind of experience growing up, I really just wanted to find ways in order for me to actually figure out like how do people like myself, like my parents, like the community around me, like how can we actually be able to thrive in sustainable communities? And so organizing really became the pathway for me to figuring out that answer. And so started off in the immigrant rights space, and then from there kind of jumped around to racial justice work, to labor work, and then finally found my way into reproductive justice work through NAPAWF. And I would say in the beginning that for me at my core, like immigrant rights is something that is like really near and dear to my heart. But I didn't really understand like what kind of relationship I had to reproductive rights and health and justice work, because that never, I mean, I always was pro-choice, and I always like, believe that people should have access to abortion, but that didn't feel like something that was particularly salient to me until I came to NAPAWF 3 years ago, and really like began to understand that, oh, actually it's reproductive justice is a lot more than just access to abortion. It really encompasses every critical decision that you're making about your life, your community, and your family. And so that's where I began to kind of like really understand like and connect these pieces together. And so since then, I've been working here as an organizer and finally being able to lead our Florida chapter, which was founded last year, actually, in the summer of 2020 by one of our chapter leaders, Sana. And really from there, it's been kind of like a really wonderful ride.
Wow. I think I'm going to need an hour with each of you separately at some point, because I would love to really explore all of your stories. I'm so blown away already. So apologies ahead of time. I might get all over the place with this because I'm so excited from hearing your backgrounds, and just feel really connected from not having a huge Asian American community around here in Florida, and, kind of growing up, with identity issues and things like that. Like, I'm sure we could share so many stories, but I do want to get to the reproductive justice because that's why I invited you on. And I feel like it's going to be like a 3-hour podcast if I go in the direction I want to, but hopefully you'll all agree to come back and have kind of, maybe a cultural discussion with me. But, if you could maybe, for our listeners, especially, and me, I'm here to be educated, by and far, because you just touched on it, that reproductive justice is more than just access to abortion. And I think that when we're having the conversation, or sometimes debate, depending on who you're speaking with, there is an immediate gate and wall that comes up when you even try to use that word, reproductive justice, or, and immediately it's you're meeting resistance. And so I would love for you to really clarify, what all that does entail. Like, what else is encompassed in that, and then also like how we can continue to kind of have that dialogue and make people a little bit more open, because you obviously have to have these conversations all the time. And then of course we're going to get into the impact of it on the AAPI community, which I think there's a misconception that it doesn't affect our community as much, very, very greatly as much as it actually does. So, sorry, multifaceted question there, but maybe the explanation of reproductive justice a little bit more in depth. Whoever wants to
Yeah,
grab
so,
it.
I'm part of the we call it RJLI, the Reproductive Justice Leadership Institute, which is a program that NAPAWF does to develop their leaders. And actually, one of the trainings that we just finished was about reproductive justice. So before NAPAWF, like I didn't understand what reproductive justice meant. Like I was like, oh, that just means like you have access to safe abortions, like kind of like the general like knowledge. Like I didn't really understand like what it actually meant. So during the training, I see like the slides like in my head, like for like what it is.
Good
Um,
student.
exactly. Like I remember because the information was so like well presented that it really sticks with you. And like there's different like kind of pillars of reproductive justice where it's like it's the right to whether you want kids or not want kids and to have the autonomy over your body. So it's not just about abortions, it's actually like the way I see it, it's more of like how you are like as a person and how you get to be in your communities. Like if you want to have children, then you should be able to have children safely with all of the healthcare that you need. You should be able to raise those children in a safe and healthy environment, and not be restricted in having to make like sacrifices and things. And again, as a child of immigrants, so I'm Indian, I don't think I mentioned that earlier. So both my parents immigrated from India, and growing up here, it's like kind of the same thing that like Sarah was saying, like we didn't really know like what our rights were and like what access to healthcare we have. It was really whatever job they had, and if they had healthcare, that's what we had. So I think reproductive justice is very much more broad than just abortions. It's about like, and also bodily autonomy, right? Like you get to make the decisions, and you should have access to information to make those decisions for yourself. So that's kind of like a recap of like what we learned in May. If you want to add anything more to that, go ahead.
No, I think you got it.
She clearly memorized the slides really well. So
Yeah.
I love that, because it is so impacting when you kind of go through life thinking, oh, well, I have a general understanding. And then when your eyes are opened to knowledge and information, it's really kind of groundbreaking. And so of course it's really impacting to you. And can we maybe speak about now like how that obviously there's the Texas abortion ban, and obviously here in Florida they are fighting for something, I don't know the laws or anything, but something very, very similar, if not exactly the same thing. And in particular, talking about the AAPI community, there is that misconception that, well, we're not really going to be affected as much as others, and so why should we get involved, why should we take a stance? Perhaps somebody can explain really what the impacts are on the AAPI community, especially because there's so many barriers that people really don't know about.
Yeah, for sure. I can speak a little bit about it. So right now we do have what we call like a copycat bill from SB 8 from Texas, which is the HB, the House Bill 167. And that one, it's very similar. It's still, making like allowing folks to like, what is it, like citizens to put on these lawsuits and things like that. A little bit difference from us is that the statute of limitations even increase higher than Texas, and then we even are, like what is it? It's still restrictive, and it's still like this high cost for folks. And really, as much as they say that it doesn't ban abortions, like they say, but we know that it does, right? Like it's making it where providers are too scared to give this service to folks, right? And most of the time too, folks don't know that they are pregnant even at 6 weeks, right? How this affects our API community is that, like you mentioned earlier, with access, we talk about language justice and the lack of language justice. So already, if you're an immigrant, you don't have the language available to get you this access, right? And now they're making it even harder for you to even know what the law is. So like if you're someone who, doesn't know where to get that information and you ask someone, and automatically now that private citizen that you ask could possibly sue you because they say, oh, you're thinking of getting this abortion care, right? And then like that adds another layer. So now it's even more hidden. So when you do want to get access, who do you reach to, right? When this information is now supposed to be hush hush and secretive. So just making it really a lot harder. And I think like us being in Florida too, when we talk about immigration rights, right, which is under reproductive justice, a lot of that conversation, they like to say that AAPI folks aren't a part of, but we have a huge population of immigrants who are AAPI, right? And we think about even those who had immigrated through the war in like the 70s and 80s, like they're still existing here. And do we have a path of immigration for them too? You know, and so then like they're not even having these services. So then it just kind of continue to like disadvantage our immigrant community. And with these abortion bans and these laws, what it does is that, you know, continue to punish our immigrant community for not being able to like understand the like the complication of access, right? And already existing now, I think within our culture, there is also not a huge conversation surrounding reproductive health, right? Reproductive justice, or like even reproductive rights within our community. So, you know, with not with having that interpersonal conversation, we now also are getting this actual law that is against us to even allow for us to have this conversation. Because what we were nervous about when SB8 originally came out was that we were thinking like, are we allowed to have this conversation now? Would that be deemed as like, oh, you're giving them information, you're you know, helping them gain an abortion, right? Like we were nervous about that. And when we think about that, you know, if we're not being able to educate our community, then what's going to happen to them?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that, kind of ties into the conversation that's been widely had ever since the start of the pandemic with the rise of the anti-Asian hate crimes and, is the model minority myth that Asians don't have, low income issues. They don't have economic issues. And that's really, I'd love for one of you to kind of speak on how that also ties into the piece of reproductive justice, because I know that it's definitely an issue with, like you said, affordable healthcare and having access. So one, of course, language barrier is huge. I mean, you're already in a situation where the language, especially in the medical and science community, it's already intimidating if you speak English and to understand. And so having that language barrier is difficult. But I think another thing that I know that you all discuss, that you all put at the forefront, is that that misinformation about the scale of economy of AAPIs in particular. So
For sure, yeah, I can jump in. So actually, NAPAWF, we have research that shows that API women are facing the highest number of long-term unemployment. And that like goes directly against like a lot of the stereotypes that we have about our community, that what the model minority myth does is that it collapses all these entire groups that are part of this API umbrella and says like, oh, actually APIs are doing great. Like they actually make more than, like the average like white person. Like, they're actually, they're in all these like really like high paying positions. Like they're doing great. Other minorities, other like people of color, like they need to be as good as APIs. So it pits our communities against one another. And also what it does, it really like, puts all of us into this umbrella and makes it seem like we're like across the board, like, we're all the same and we're doing great, which is that's not actually what the data shows. And that also is not what is actually, the case in our everyday realities. If we're thinking also again back to, SB8 and the impact that it does for APIs in Florida, there's actually research that shows that, API folks in Texas have actually gone to other states that don't border the state itself in order to access abortions. And so Florida is actually one of those states where there's a lot of people in Texas who are trying to access abortion, who they actually have to, travel miles in order for them to be able to do so. So they're coming to Florida to do that. So if we're like putting all these pieces together, like thinking about, what does it actually take for someone to be able to access an abortion? like first they need to know that these resources exist. And in the state of Florida, there's a lot of these fake pregnancy centers called crisis pregnancy centers that essentially shame, intimidate, and manipulate people who are pregnant from, and like essentially like deceiving them from getting the care that they want in order to, actually be able to live the lives they want. And so what it does is that these CPCs, these crisis pregnancy centers, they again lie, deceive, manipulate, shame, intimidate pregnant people from and convince them from not getting an abortion when they actually do like want it and also need it. And so there's a lot of crisis pregnancy centers in Florida. So if we're thinking about even just like the first step of being able to get abortion care, like knowing that these resources exist. If you look up how to get an abortion in Florida, the first thing you see are these crisis pregnancy centers. And they're really, really just devious because like a lot of them are, will like put themselves near like actual abortion clinics, like for example, like Planned Parenthood. And also they'll like start to like translate materials into like in language. And so like we'll have like a lot of resources in Spanish or Haitian Creole. And something that we've also seen is that, sometimes these resources are also translated into AAPI languages as well. And so they're like really like, like
They're
very
organized.
deciduous and
Yeah.
right, like very organized. And so if we're thinking about, okay, the first step in order for someone to get abortion care, they need to know that these resources exist. But if they don't speak English, if they're just looking it up online, they might not actually get the resources and the knowledge that they actually need to make decisions about their own bodies and the way that they want to live their lives. If we're then thinking about the next step, like, okay, maybe they do get the right information, but then how do they actually go about to get an abortion? Like, they like, there's like so many barriers related to like language, but also like cost and whether you can take time of work and whether you can actually travel. And just even just like the financial barriers of, how to actually, logistically make it so that you can go to an abortion clinic. Like all these barriers, they're compounded on one another. And then finally, if we're thinking about like immigration status, that being another layer, just like, kind of delving more into like what May was talking about earlier, like there's a lot of fear, especially during the pandemic, like there's a lot of fear that, APIs have about, just like being outside, right? And then this is like fear that, a lot of us already had, especially as API women just existing in public space, but that's become a lot more, prevalent, particularly because of all the rhetoric we've been hearing about COVID. But if we're thinking about, okay, like, you're an API woman, you're already like, feeling some type of way about being outside in public space, particularly in a pandemic, but then you're also an immigrant and maybe you do have a precarious immigration status and situation, then those are just, more fears and more barriers that prevent you from being able to actually access the care that you need. And so when we think about reproductive justice, we actually need to think about all those different aspects, like the different identities and experiences that we have that really, that really complicate the model minority myth because we're not all the same. There's a lot of different ways that our identities and experiences interact with one another, making it so that like, whether it's like we're trying to access abortion care, whether it's contraception, whether it's like we're just even just trying to be able to put food on the table for our families or keep our families together. There's all these different ways that these identities and experiences interact with one another in order for those to kind of inform the way that we live our lives and the way that we take care of our families and live in community together.
Yeah. Wow, that's a lot to unpack and a lot of information. And I'm curious in the work that you've been doing and the work that you've done, especially from the last 3 years, from the last several months, from the last year, what's been kind of the reception to, the abortion bans that have started in Texas and then like knowing that it's coming here, you work closely with a lot of AAPI community leaders and different organizations. Do you feel like there is a heightened awareness because of what's happened in Texas? Do you feel like there's still not nearly enough awareness? Because even within any community, any BIPOC community, you know, there's going to be layers. There's going to be people who are extraordinarily affected, and some people who are just in a different, you know, in a different situation where they really just think, oh well, you know, I'm fine. I'm an AAPI woman. I'm okay, and they, you know, they think that it doesn't affect it, because it's just so hard to, you know, kind of put yourself in other people's shoes when you're so bombarded with COVID and your kids and your life, and it's not an excuse and it's not okay, but it's reality, right? And so I was curious where you feel we're at in terms of the reception of knowing how dangerous this ban would be, in having enough people engaged to where it would make them look at our leaders and our legislators, and when voting time comes, make decisions based on what's going to be good for society and for our fellow humans that, you know, we should be kind of, you know, kind of taking care of one another with. So what do you feel like is the temperature with that awareness?
I'll take this one, but feel free to jump in if I like end up not saying something you have in mind. Honestly, within when we think of the reproductive justice space in Florida, like we're part of a coalition of other organizations that work with the repro space, and we're probably the only API space. Like we're like probably like the one that's in Florida that has this representation for reproductive justice. And so even with that in mind, we're one out of like the 50 organization that is already currently doing it, but yet that information isn't accessible to our community because they don't have that viewpoint, like, you know, that multi-layered of like, this is immigration rights for us, this is healthcare for us, this is, you know, all these things in between, versus sometimes when there aren't, this is kind of the same for other BIPOC community too, is that when we're having this conversation about reproductive justice, sometimes different spaces that aren't BIPOC led or, you know, BIPOC initiated, they tend to focus very narrowly, right? And they only focus on that one thing and not worry about the rest that does impact when we say reproductive justice. And so with that, it has been difficult, right? Like trying to find folks that to be able to even have this conversation, because another part of the API community in Florida is that, yes, we know the statistics is that we're one of the fastest growing population in the state, right? But then when you break it down, where are we and who are we within the API community? We're very scattered. There are some communities here, there's some communities there. And even if you have communities within the same county, you're also separated. You know, like I think with us in Florida, that is different from other locales that have a huge API population, is that we have our numbers, but we're still very siloed into our specific communities, right? And so with NAPAWF, what we're trying to do is become this space for folks who are from all different parts of our API community to come and convene and like have this conversation. Because although, yes, like we have our own like differences, a lot of our struggles or even a lot of our joy still like can affect like all of us, right? That we can like be under this umbrella. As much as we still want data disaggregation within Florida, we also need to come in as a huge community to show that, like, you know, we are this like powerful block of people, right? And that like we can make a difference when we come together to work with each other. And, you know, and that's what my goal is for NAPAWF with as an organizer, is finding out these like pockets of our community and like having these conversations to say, you know, right now you're really trying to get, you know, maybe access for the Filipino community in Pinellas Park. They're doing the same thing in St. Petersburg with the Vietnamese community. Like, how do we work together to get that for all of us, right? Like, how do we like put our numbers in and like let those who are decision makers listen to what we say? And then also a part of NAPAWF is that we're trying to also develop leaders to then be those decision makers too. You know, like that. Those are like those, I guess, like tiered, layered future goals that we have. Is like, first, like how do we get ourselves to be in community with each other, and then from there, like how do we then help each other be a part of these decision making positions and then make our voice heard, right? And then like really making this impact, because yeah, I love saying that we're a growing population in Florida, but it's like, but what are we doing with that, right? Like what are we doing for our people, what are we doing for our community? Because if we're not the ones that are at the table to make these decisions, other folks are going to make that decision for us. And they're not going to be able to know our story. They're not going to understand where we're coming from and like what we need for our community. And so it definitely needs to come from us. And so for me, within Florida, that's kind of like the gap that I've been seeing. And that goes for reproductive justice, but that also goes just in general for any other policies that we have, right? And that again, at the crux of it too, is language access, right? Like how do we get our people to know this information? Because growing up, I remember something, when we first immigrated, and I know the whole 5-year thing with our green card, and then my mom get her citizenship, right? All those things. And then I remember that as a kid, like I knew that healthcare was already expensive. And I knew this at 8 years old, like that healthcare is expensive and that I shouldn't get sick because like we weren't getting, like the only time we'll be able to go to the doctors, we went to like the emergency room because we didn't have health insurance. And then me not really knowing why, like my mom would just say, oh, it's because, we're on our green card, we just can't get health insurance. And then that was it. There was no conversation about like, how do we change this? Like, why is this the rule? And, like, why is this the law? And we were just supposed to believe it. And then now being here where I am, learning more about why these laws like how these laws exist and how it affected our family and how like we actually can make a difference, right? Like we can actually mobilize ourselves to push for our policies to change. And that wasn't something I was taught growing up, that like, you can make these changes and you can like, make these differences, and it doesn't have to be the realities like, oh yeah, that's just the way it is, we don't have insurance. It's like, wait, why? Like not even questioning that and just believing that it's a fact of life. Because again, we just don't have our folks at the decision table to then tell us like, actually, no, you can change this, right? Like you can make this difference. And so ultimately, that's really what I see as the gap in Florida, is how do we fill that to like have people believe that we don't have to just be passerbys, or passengers in this in our like lives. Like we can actually purposely make these choices and like make a difference with our community, and instead of doing reactive work, we can do proactive work, and I think that just really comes back with like us making sure that we're building this community in Florida.
And obviously through this organization and the work you're all doing. So did anyone else want to add to that, or
I just wanted to add, like, from a personal, like, experience. So I feel like personally, like, I'm kind of new to like the activism work, but like whenever I talk about it, like even with my family, like there is like a general sense of like, oh, you can do that. Like you can actually stand up for yourself. Kind of how May was like saying earlier, like we growing up here, like we were always taught like keep your head down, just do your work, get to whatever levels you need to get to, be successful, but don't rock the boat, don't create a scene, don't cause problems. And so when my sister and I like talk about like reproductive justice, and like I get excited, like, oh yeah, like I'm doing RJLI and this is like what I've learned about, like it's always like kind of like a surprise to them. But I don't think it's a surprise in a bad way. It's just like I think my family and some of my friends, like they just didn't know like this was an option, like for us to actually fight and like stand up for our rights without having like these like crazy like consequences or like fear. And like yes, I still feel afraid sometimes, like because I do have like more conservative like members of my family, so like I still feel afraid. But I think one thing I love about NAPAWF is that there's a sense of like community that's really strong. Like we all have really similar experiences like growing up. And I think the fact that we're all in Florida like makes a big difference too, because I think the AAPI experience in Florida is very unique, like we've been saying like earlier.
We're using very nice adjectives to
I know.
describe it. I think we should probably rip that Band-Aid off and be a little more.
Yeah.
But yes.
It's tough. It was really tough. And like,
Yeah.
I grew up in a really small town, and I never went through sex education in my schooling, like at all. Like I learned about puberty in 8th grade, I think. And it was a 30-minute video. All the boys and girls in the class were in it together. We learned about body hair and period, and the girls were separated for an extra 20-minute video on periods. And I remember leaving like thinking like I don't understand this. Like, and I had already gotten my period at that point, and I literally left like I don't know what I just what I just
Yeah.
learned.
Thank you
So
for
yeah.
sharing that. That is so insightful because that kind of like goes into the realm of education, which is something that I've been really passionate working on as well. And so, but that is so true. And I really want to use this opportunity to seg into like the stigma of being our, the next like generation or generation from, immigrant parents and or even immigrants ourselves, right? Like that stigma of having any sort of discussion about sexual education or reproductive health, and words like this are just very frowned upon. I don't know if it was the same in your household, but you're right. I recall the same thing in middle school, getting that video, and it was not PE, it was like that counterpart to it where you had that 1 hour and that was it. And I told my mom, she's like, oh, that's good, I'm glad you learned about that, and it was just like very brush off. And I know another thing that you all are advocates for is like mental health. And these are areas in particular, I think that the AAPI community, this is where we have work, right? Like we are very much known for having a very strong, family dynamic and that respect of our elders, and like just loving food and having just these type of cultural things that have always been very strong. But one of the things that I feel so devastated about are the stigmas of like talking about mental health, talking about reproductive health, and how we can really work on that so that our future generations don't go through that. And I think it is changing. I think it is changing. I mean, on a personal note, I mean, my listeners already know I've shared my story a lot, but I mean, I was like practically 40 years old before I shared with my family in the world like my experience as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And so like I'm not going to say that's because I'm Asian. I will say there's a lot of other things, but I mean, it's a big part of it, knowing that maybe this will bring shame to my parents that I'm sharing this, or maybe, and just anything to do with these, difficult conversations. I'm not saying it should be easy, but talk to me about how we can destigmatize, and what are ways that you all have discussed as, in your organization, because I'm dying to learn here.
Yeah, so I think, like you're saying, like education is a huge part of all of that, and I think NAPAWF does a really great job, especially with its members, just like educating about like even the history, like what our history is, like being here, and like where our collective stories like come from. And I think another huge thing is sharing in a space that you feel comfortable first. Because when I first came to NAPAWF, like I would never like I couldn't even say like condoms or periods, like but in a space like if it wasn't my sister or like my best friend. And coming to NAPAWF, like we're encouraged to have conversations with each other and sharing our stories. And like the more you listen and the more you hear, it's always like, wow, like I went through that too. And so we start sharing like our stories of ourselves and like how we've always felt shame talking about certain topics, especially when it comes to sexual health and reproductive health. And after having a lot of those conversations, like personally I feel much more confident like sharing my stories with other people outside of like my safe like NAPAWF community. So like I brought it up with like some of my female cousins and like acquaintances that like I meet through like dance or like something where it's not that I've known them for years and years, but I've started to feel more comfortable. And I think that's where it starts. Like, I think for an individual like level, like it's important to feel like comfortable sharing your story in a safe space. And then once you have that confidence to take that story and share it with other people, because if you don't talk about it, nobody's going to know. And I think a lot of people need to hear that like other people have gone through the same experiences, because it feels more like humanizing, and it feels like there might be a way to fix it. If there's a lot of us that have experienced similar things, like maybe we can come together and make sure that the next generation doesn't have to go through this. Because I feel like if we don't know, like how do we know what to change? Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to kind of like pay off from Priyanka, just like for me, organizing has always been healing work for me, because it's been a way for me to like really understand not just like the world around me, but to really understand myself. Like, why do I care about this work so much that I'm putting all these hours, like really doing a lot of introspective work around like, what is it that I care about? Why do I care about that? Like, where does that come from? And so, kind of like Priyanka was talking about, like learning about your history, I think that is so powerful. Just learning about your history and being able to get the language to talk about your history, the history that you share with your community, with your family, and also just like your own personal history as well. For me, organizing has been such a healing experience because it's not just, like it part of it is like being in community with other people who share similar experiences and working to make changes, but also part of it is like the language to talk about issues, like to be able to have words like reproductive justice that are a framework for you to bring all these different ideas that you've always felt like. It's like reproductive justice was a new concept to me like 3 years ago, but it wasn't something that I had never thought about it with just like without the language of reproductive justice. Like I had always felt that way, that like all these issues are connected, but I just don't know how they're connected, right? And so I think this work in general of organizing, of activism, of being community with one another allows us to be able to develop language. And I think that's also part of it when it comes to like being able to have difficult conversations with like either family members or acquaintances or people that you're just meeting for the first time on the street. Something that we do really often and like do all the time at NAPAWF is outreach. And we don't just do personal outreach, we also do outreach to complete strangers. So like we'll go on the street, we'll go to community events, we'll go to grocery stores and just have conversations with people about what are the things that feel really relevant to their lives. And something that I've, like discovered through the years is how important it is that when you are having conversations with people, especially for the first time, that you are actually meeting them where they're at. If I just like talk to an auntie who's like trying to sell her fruit like on the street about reproductive justice, she'll be like, why are you talking to me, right? That's really trying to understand like, okay, how can I break down like these ideas in ways that I know will actually like strike a chord with people, that will actually feel relevant to their lives. So when I'm talking to that auntie on the street who's trying to sell fruit, I'll be like, like, do you have like are you where's your family from? Like, like, do you have like children? Like, what's your experience like raising your children? And like, even if we don't speak the same language, like I've like talked to like Chinese aunties who speak very limited English, speak Mandarin, I don't, and I speak Korean, right? Like there's that language barrier, and yet we're able to break those down because we're sharing our stories, and we're being able to articulate these really complex issues in ways that are actually understandable and meaningful to our lives.
Yeah. So moving into, the activism part, and you all are obviously very, very passionate. You all have, you now have the resources, you have a community, and now we need to let like everybody else know. And that's the hard part, right? The hard part is the outreach and what you just mentioned. I'm just having these awesome visions of you just walking around the grocery store, like, I'm going to talk to that lady about, reproductive health. And I'm going to talk to that person over there about, sex education. And I think that's amazing. But, we're in Florida. We've all kind of had this whole like Florida. I've been podcasting for several years now. I started in 2016 because I felt like I needed to amplify the voices of others, build through empathy, through storytelling, also have an outlet so that I could share my rage and frustration, and just to have that other voice. And I just really loved it. I've met amazing people like yourselves. I've reconnected with friends from places, and just had conversations I would never have normally had. And but through that work, I almost always have to say, oh, hey, nice to see you. Yes, I'm here in Florida. I'm sorry. And I'm always apologizing on behalf of Florida because 100% that week in the news, something has happened, from political to like the largest alligator walking across the whatever and biting a person. I mean, it's like there's always something happening in Florida. And it's just like, not that I'm at all happy about what's been going on in Texas, but it like gave me a moment of where I'm like, well, Texas is kind of taking the number one spot for a second. So, but it's just frustrating, right? Because we love it here. This is my home. Full time, my job is I teach Kung Fu, and we're established here. I mean, my school's been there 41 years. We're not moving. It's a huge temple. It's the, the first Kung Fu temple in the United States. I can't just leave Florida. Like, my life is here. And so my decision is to stay and fight, right? And so I am here and I'm in it, but I'm always apologizing on behalf of Florida. So we've got some really critical elections coming up. We've got really critical bills that we need to combat and things. Like, what is the plan? Like, how can we engage? What can we do to make a difference? Like, what are the next action steps?
Yeah, sure. And totally, I hear you, right? Like we said, best Floridians. But that was something that was surprising to me when I first came back to Florida, because I've been away for quite some time. And being able to be an organizer and being in these spaces, learning about all these other organizations that are actually like doing a lot of great work, but doesn't get the recognition because again, we're like vying for the new space between Florida man who like ate bath salts, you know what I mean? Like that's what we're fighting against in the media, you know? And then like being here and seeing like, oh my gosh, there are a ton of activists and a ton of groups that are doing great work. It's just that we're not getting this press, right? Like we're just not getting this recognition. And so for me personally, being a part of NAPAWF and being around other folks is showing me that like, oh, there's a lot of dedicated Floridians who do want to change the tide. And ultimately, if we're thinking things about policies and politics, is Florida is pretty purple when we break it down to like our counties and our local elections. It's not always red as people assume that it is. And so it's really about those margins that can be won by just a couple thousand people, 20,000 people or something like that. And so how we do that, if NAPAWF is that we know the statistics of the number of eligible API voters, right? So now is for us being that we're trying to organize with our API folks is we are trying to find counties and locales that have our community and how do we reach to them, right? Like how do we network to them and like let them know that it's like these are these critical moments that are happening. Actually in Florida, fun fact is that there's an election every year, right? We don't have just only the even years. Like we just had a recent election in St. Petersburg, right? That we just voted for our new mayor who we just voted for like a few other council members. And when we think of policies and especially for our folks, we want to stress how critical it is to be involved in your local local campaigns and just like local community, because that's how we do our work too, right? As a community-led organization, we start from like where we are now, right? Like how do we reach you and how can we bring you into this work? And most of that is going to be about, oh, I don't want this stop sign in front of this place, or like I don't want a speed bump in front of my house, right? It's like all of these things that happens, like how do you make that change, right? How do you organize around that? And so that's kind of what we think about is we first figure out, okay, what are those locales that we can then outreach to and talk to these folks and ask them, what is it that you care about, right? Like for us, we, of course, when we said reproductive justice, a lot of folks can be like, stop short. They're like, oh, I don't care about abortion. Like, I don't care about that thing. It's like, no, we're talking about healthcare. We're talking about immigration, like all these things. And so we might not lead with say like, oh, do you care about reproductive justice? Because there really isn't a definition that is available for a lot of folks. So we'll ask them like, do you care about immigration rights? Do you care about healthcare access? Do you care about language access? So having those conversations and like trying to figure out from folks what are the issues they care about. So then now showing up there is an outlet for you to be able to put your voice out there and be a part of this decision making, right? And then so that's what we're doing is figuring that out. And then once we find our locales, we also then figure out the language that we need in order to have these conversations with folks. And so when we're building our team of canvassers, we want to make sure that they're able to communicate this information in the local language too, right? I don't know, I said local language. That makes sense. Sorry, because I was thinking local language is what we use in like international development world, and I was like,
It's
wait, I
okay.
can use it here in this domestic world. I was like, wait, that also makes sense. But like, yeah, like learning the local language, and then from there, like having those critical conversations, and um, then I think the ask is like these smaller ask, I would say. It's like, hey, like come to a meeting, like learn more about this thing. And it's like, oh, like then explain to them, like why voting even matters, right? Like voting truly is like not the only way, right? Because you can come to also meetings, like town hall meetings. When was the last time someone went to a town hall meeting? Well, because of COVID, we know not a lot. But even then, right? Like having those things where like just the fact that you're able to say what you care about out loud to folks that like that's supposed to represent you, right? Like it's even like informing them in those ways too, is figuring out like where is it that is the gap for them to get activated, right? Like what is that need to happen? Because a lot of the times we are like other folks who aren't within the community trying to do this voter engagement work is they have a lot of assumptions about our community, right? They're like, oh, they just don't know this, or like, oh, they just think, whatever, and then like only target that one section. It's like, well, that's not true, right? It's like, is it because it's not accessible? Like you don't give them the language to know it, right? Like you can break down, you can give us infographics, but if they don't understand it, then like that's not going to be, really a big help to them at all. And so for us, that's what we're doing. But for these next couple within NAPAWF, starting around March or so, we're going to continue like really heavily like canvassing and figuring out like, what are the issues that our community care about within Central Florida. And then from there, like, okay, so how do we get this language accessible to folks in this community in these regions, right? And we know that like I mentioned before, we're pockets all over the state, but we found that like Central Florida really is like a critical number. And a lot of our races within Central Florida too are critical races in the local elections and even in like our general like representative elections and things like that too. So we want to make sure that people are building this power to make these changes, make these votes, but ultimately too beyond voting is continuing to be activated and going to these town halls and letting our voice be heard. Because now, growing up in St. Petersburg and Palos Park area, I am like visibly seeing a lot more API folks. Before it would be like, oh, I know this auntie, like, or this auntie knows me, like at our local mom and pop shop. But now it's like strangers. So it's like, what are we doing with folks who are now coming into our community, and like, where can we be a landing space for them, right? Like those are our next steps. It's like figuring out how do we bring folks in to show them that like, we are wanting to build this collective together, right? We don't have to just be siloed and like folks doing our own thing all the time when we're clearly suffering under policies that are being made, not like for us, but not by us, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did anyone else want to weigh in or? Just checking. Okay. And I would love for before we run out of time, I do want to ask everybody one more question, but before I forget, I don't want to forget to make sure I do a little call to action here on how people can get involved with NAPAWF and what are ways for someone who says, I'm just too busy, I can't come to meetings, I don't have time, I don't want to be a member of another thing, and what's the process for the bite-sized action that people can take to still feel like they are making a difference, but maybe don't have the full commitment to be able to like be completely engaged.
So yeah, I think one of the things like the Florida chapter does specifically, we call them tea and talkings, and they're really short meetings, like once a month, and they're really great because we talk about a lot of different topics, and like each month is like a different thing. So I think that's a like a really good way to like come through, and like they're not very like it's not a big time commitment, and you'll usually get to learn something new.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we do fun things. Like we had one teen talking where it was just a game night. So we all like invited like some of our friends, and we just got to hang out and do a game night. And there's been other teen talkings where we've talked about like more heavier issues like domestic violence in the AAPI community. So there's a lot of different like topics that we do. I think that's like a really good like bite size is to like come to one of those because those are open usually to any AAPI folks like in Florida,
Mm-hmm.
without like having to be a member. That's the main one I can think of. May, if you want to add anything else.
Yeah, just to go with that, we do have a team talking. I don't know when this will be posted, but we have one coming up on Thursday. And for us, it's like bringing in an API person that you're really thankful for to go on the theme of this month. And so from there, we'll like get to know each other and things like that and celebrate one another during that time. But something that we also try to have another like kind of bite size into like getting this involved with like being activated is we try to host phone banking and text banking events where we're outreaching to API women, right? So for us, it's like we're constantly wanting, as we're a new chapter, we're constantly wanting to know like what are the issues that our community care about in this state, right? Like we don't want to make assumptions. We don't want to make like be like the other folks who make assumptions about ourselves. So we're doing this outreach. And so for folks who are curious about like what that looks like, we train folks on how to do phone banking, and it's not as intimidating as it sounds, and it is pretty fun to like get to talk to people as well. Like I feel like sometimes people like have this stigma that's like, oh, our generation don't like to talk on the phone and things like that, which sometimes can be true, but with phone banking, it's always nice because you have support of other folks who are also doing the same, right? So if you had a question during your conversation with someone, we're available to ask, right? And like it's a really a community, and we're just like trying to outreach our own folks to figure out how can I help you, right? Like where are you at now? Like what do you need from us? Like what do you need from the community, and how do we get there with you? So we do have a phone banking event happening next week on Tuesday, and we're like cognizant of people's time, so we try to do around like 7 p.m. In Florida time. And then we also another thing that we, of course, like you said, even with our chapter meetings, we have them once a month. And so if you just want to learn a little bit more about us, or just want to be in community with other API women and gender expansive folks, we have that available, and there's usually just an hour long too, right? So we have those meetings every month. And then this is kind of a newer call to action that we're hoping to push out for, is that with our reproductive coalition that we're part of called the Floridians for Reproductive Justice, we are hosting like a day of action in Tallahassee in January. So it's still a little bit of time, thinking about like January 12th, which is the second day of the Florida legislation. So we really want to make an impact and show, just other Floridians that we do care about it when you're trying to put legislations that are going to restrict our reproductive access, right? And so for us, we want to show up to show them that, this affects our API community, and we want other folks to know, right? Like we want to represent ourselves fully to say that when we're talking about this fight, this isn't just a white woman fight, right? This isn't just a what, like it affects us too. And so for us, that's another call of action, is we want to show up at the Capitol to show them that, like this is an issue that API folks care about, and we are also affected by it. And that's something we're going to be consistently like looking out for the rest of the year, is trying to see how we can like have folks show up during that day.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, people can follow your website, learn more about you, and donate and and be involved that way as well. I'm looking on your website now, but I'm presuming you have some social media things. What's the tag? Maybe someone can just yell it out in case someone's driving and they're listening.
Yeah, pretty easy. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and it's just NAPAWF.Florida. So just our full name there.
Perfect, perfect. And I'll link that as well in the show notes so that people can see it and learn more about your awesome organization. So, we of course are always short on time here because like I said, I need an hour with each of you. But, in closing, I'd love for each of you to just, kind of share again a little bit about, what the work you're doing means to you, and if there's a personal story attached or anything like that, or anything else you'd just like to share kind of in closing. So, Prianca?
Yeah. Oh gosh, there's so much that I could say. You're right. I could probably spend like an hour talking about like just how much like NAPAWF means to me. But like I'll just like keep it short. I think for me, NAPAWF has just built my confidence in who I am as an Indian American woman. And for a long time, like I felt like I had to fight to be seen as Asian, especially like growing up. Like we were like always like separated. It's like, oh, like you're not this kind of Asian. Like, oh, you're South Asian. Like you don't really count. Um, and even like going to like college, like being a part of groups, like it was very clear that like, you know, South Asians had their own group, East Asians had their own group, and NAPAWF is kind of like the first space where we're all included and we all have a voice equally. And to me, that's just really special, and like one of the things that just makes me feel like I have a community. So yeah, that's like my main thing. I really love that how NAPAWF just, it really brings us all together. There's no, even though like Asian Americans, like we're not a monolith, like there's so many different cultures and languages we all speak, but NAPAWF is like the first space where I've been in where like we all have an equal voice and we can all work together on issues that we feel passionate about. And I think that's what keeps me going and just really excited about the work.
Excellent. Thank you. And Seri?
Yeah, I think, some of the like common threads that we've been kind of talking about throughout this entire show for the past hours, just like the reputation that like Florida has, like, within the country, but even just like internationally as well. Like people have all these thoughts about Florida. And the thing that I want to say is that, there are so many like communities of color that live here that are, affected by issues and legislation that they didn't necessarily weren't at the table to decide, right? And like there's a lot of real opportunity for us to make real moves and changes and to really shake things up. And so I think that, if you are an AAPI woman in Florida, like NAPAWF Florida can be your political home. It can be, a space for you to find community, for you to, kind of like what Prianca was saying, build your confidence and be really able to grow with other people and start to heal from this work, from, just everything that's happening in the world and be able to heal together in community. So just wanted to plug NAPAWF Florida again.
Of course. Thank you. May.
Yeah, thank you so much also like for giving us this opportunity. For me with like this work is that it just shows me, there is so much power that we already have. It's just about recognizing that this power that we have as a community, right, as AAPI folks, where for a long time our society hasn't given us that. Like they've said that, oh no, like, you're fine, like you're hitting the American dream, just work hard, right? And then even within our own households, we'll then say like, yeah, you're right, just keep working hard and you get there. And not already like recognizing how much power we already hold within ourselves. And now it's just about like, how do we all use our personal power to like collectively build this bigger power and like making this stride, like making this difference. And with me, with NAPAWF is I love that we are working in this reproductive justice framework because it intersects in all of our identity, right? Some of us are immigrants, some of us are born here in the US, some of us knows English really well, some of us don't, right? But with reproductive justice and within NAPAWF, we're wanting to accommodate all of these identities because we know these identities exist and that's the reality, right? And for me, that has been so important that intersectionality is not something we strive for. Intersectionality is like the base, and that is what is the difference for me, is that we're recognizing how our lives are so intersectional and like our work has to be intersectional and our solutions have to be intersectional because the problems that exist are also intersectional, right? And that for me has been really encouraging because it forces us to like repaint this narrative that there's this scarcity, that we can only choose one thing to focus on or one issue to focus on, when we know that when we force ourselves to do that, we'll never be able to gain that power. We'll never be able to actually make these strides that are good for our community unless we're tackling all of these at once. And we do have the ability to do so. We just have to believe it because we do have the power to make that change, right? So for me, I think like that's what I really appreciate is the fact that we don't believe in this idea that there's not enough of us to be able to do something. Like there definitely is. Like we have to believe that.
Well, thank you so much. May, Seri, and Prianca, I'm super inspired and honored to have had this conversation and excited to learn more about that Florida chapter of National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. And I am definitely going to be interested in learning more and talking to you all again in the future because I feel like there's so much more we have. That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to the Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Please subscribe and rate my podcast on your platform of choice and leave a review.
Thank
You can become a patron of the show at patreon.com/SifuMimiChan to help keep this podcast going. Follow me and interact on social media at SifuMimiChan on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook.